Welcome to episode 126 of Lucretius Today. This is the podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we begin Epicurus' letter to Pythocles. Now let's join Joshua reading today's text.
Cleon brought me a letter from you in which you continue to express a kindly feeling towards me, which is a just return for my interest in you, and you attempt with some success to recall the arguments which lead to a life of blessedness. You ask me to send you a brief argument about the phenomena of the sky in a short sketch, that you may easily recall it to mind. For you say that what I have written in my other works is hard to remember, even though, as you state, you constantly have them in your hands. I was glad to receive your request and felt constrained to answer it by pleasant expectations for the future. Therefore, as I have finished all my other writings, I now intend to accomplish your request, feeling that these arguments will be of value to many other persons as well, and especially to those who have but recently tasted the genuine inquiry into nature, and also to those who are involved too deeply in the business of some regular occupation. Therefore, lay good hold on it, keep it in mind, and go through it all keenly, together with the rest which I sent in the small epitome to Herodotus. First of all, then, we must not suppose that any other object is to be gained from the knowledge of the phenomena of the sky, whether they are dealt with in connection with other doctrines or independently, than peace of mind and a sure confidence, just as in all other branches of study. We must not try to force an impossible explanation, nor employ a method of inquiry like our reasoning either about the modes of life or with respect to the solution of other physical problems. Witness such propositions as that the universe consists of bodies and the intangible, or that the elements are indivisible, and all such statements in circumstances where there is only one explanation which harmonizes with phenomena. For this is not so with the things above us. They admit of more than one cause of coming into being, and more than one account of their nature, which harmonizes with our sensations. For we must not conduct scientific investigation by means of empty assumptions and arbitrary principles, but follow the lead of phenomena. For our life has not now any place for irrational belief and groundless imaginings, but we must live free from trouble. Now all goes on without disturbance as far as regards each of those things which may be explained in several ways so as to harmonize with what we perceive, when one admits, as we are bound to do, probable theories about them. But when one accepts one theory and rejects another, which harmonizes as well with the phenomenon, it is obvious that he altogether leaves the path of scientific inquiry and has recourse to myth. Now, we can obtain indications of what happens above from some of the phenomena on earth, or we can observe how they come to pass, but we cannot observe the phenomena in the sky, for they may be produced in several ways. Yet we must never desert the appearance of each of these phenomena, and further, as regards what is associated with it, must distinguish those things whose production in several ways is not contradicted by phenomena on earth.
Joshua, thank you for reading that for us this morning. We have the great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast our friend Don, who is going to be here for at least the next 2 weeks with us as we begin the study of the letter to Pythocles. And so that's going to give us extra firepower for especially today and the early parts of this letter to Pythocles, now that we've just completed the letter to Herodotus it's going to be very interesting to compare the approach that Epicurus takes in the letter to Pythocles versus the letter to Herodotus, which Herodotus, in summary, appears to be a more general beginning point for the study of nature. And as we will address here in the very opening of this letter, the letter to Pythocles is more oriented towards the phenomena of the sky, the things that we see above us that we don't have the ability to get as much direct evidence about as what we can see around us here on Earth. But especially here in the beginning of this letter, there is some introductory material that seems to me to be extremely important for all of Epicurean philosophy, because so many of the issues that we deal with involve things that we have limited amounts of information about. We don't have the ability to walk up to the tower and determine whether it's square or round when we're talking about things like what goes on in the heavens above us. We can't get to the sun or get to the moon. At least we could not during Epicurus' time and until very recently. And so we have to deal with very important questions about which we have limited information, especially when we are confronted by people around us who have alleged in the past that, for example, the sun or the planets or the stars might themselves be gods, or at the very least, even today, you have people who are going to assert that the motions of these planets and the stars and everything we see above us, everything we see around us, is supernatural in origin and supernatural in guidance. And we don't have the ability to get there ourselves and check that out. So we have to decide what we're going to do with the limited information that's available to us. And so possibly this letter to Pythocles, even more so than some of the other material we have, is going to be of critical importance to us. And how do we deal with questions about which we don't have the ability to get up close and personal with the issues that we're talking about? So with that as an introduction, let's just start in with line number 84, which is where Epicurus is basically thanking Cleon for sending him the letter and telling him that he's happy to respond and give him an additional summary. It's kind of interesting that Pythocles apparently is telling Epicurus that he's got all of his books available to him, and yet even though he has those books available, he finds it hard to remember the important points. So it's almost as if he's asking Epicurus for an outline of the really major important things that he has to remember, even when he can't find them in the books in front of him. And then the last part that I'll comment on before I turn it over to everybody else is it's interesting to me. Epicurus says, "I was glad to receive your request and felt constrained to answer it by pleasant expectations of the future." So kind of an interesting comment there by Epicurus, that he's not only happy to receive the request and realizes it's going to be useful to Pythocles, but expects pleasant expectations for the future as a result of having written it. So Epicurus is always thinking about pleasure as the ultimate goal of everything that he's doing. So with that as a beginning of 84, who wants to comment on any of the details there?
I think you're absolutely right, Cass. Just to point to that last line, I mentioned at the very end of the letter to Herodotus that while we mostly discuss the philosophy itself, every once in a while we pull back the veil on the original garden and how it worked. And it was the same in the letter to Herodotus, this idea that people are coming to Epicurus with questions that they need answers to. This is not just one lone crank, just pumping out works that no one's ever going to read. People are requesting this stuff, even after they've read his much longer works. And this issue of a summary or a short sketch, I just want to make a point about the word argument in the second sentence. We think of an argument as disagreement between two people or a line of reasoning to establish a point. But the word argument in a more archaic usage can mean a summary. And so that seems to me to be what we're looking at. And there is a line of reasoning that will follow. For example, if you read John Milton's Paradise Lost, he'll start every book with the argument of the book, which is the summary of that section. And so this is Epicurus's summary on the phenomena of the sky, or meteorology.
And one of the things that strikes me about this letter at the very beginning is that it really, in some ways, for me at least, humanizes the whole idea of Epicurus and the students of the garden. And that, he's addressing them by name. He's talking about the kindly feelings. I think one of the things that at least I sometimes forget is that these were living, breathing human beings that had personal interactions with each other. And so I think that whenever he names Cleon by name and he talks about the kindly feelings, and you can almost imagine him sitting down at his desk and, thinking about, oh yeah, Cleon, I haven't seen him in a long time. It was so nice to get his letter, that sort of thing. It's a very humanizing sort of way to approach the philosophy too, because I think it really provides that, like Joshua said, a viewpoint into how the garden actually worked, that these were living, breathing human beings.
Yeah, and one more thing I'd like to say about this is that line that Cassius pointed out about pleasant expectations for the future. I think that says quite a lot. This is not eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. This is, you're trying to build a life of happiness here. And part of building a life of happiness is to understand phenomena so you can sort of rule out various
divine retribution and that sort of thing.
Those causes of things that will actually produce anxiety, that's a problem, and that will produce a fear of death, that's a problem. But more than that, we're talking about, I think, laying out the groundwork now, and he says elsewhere, it's never too early to start, laying out the groundwork now for a life that will bring you pleasure. And part of that is just what he's talking about here, pleasant expectations for the future, by sharing the meaning of the philosophy.
Joshua, let me play on what you just said there, and again focused on the very last part there about those pleasant expectations. One of the questions that we get on a very regular basis from people who are studying Epicurus is that they have heard or read or have the impression that Epicurus was really not that much interested in science, and that he had a sort of a grudging approach to it where he wanted science to help him have a good time, but ultimately there's something negative or something lacking in Epicurus's approach to science, that he wanted enough to get by, but that was all he was interested in doing, and that there's really an unenthusiastic embrace of science in Epicurean philosophy, which I think is absolutely wrong, and I fight back at that every opportunity I get. And one of the ways I think people have to understand this is that Epicurus is rigorously, in all of his writings and in his whole philosophy, he's determined through his study of nature that pleasure is the goal, that having a happy life is the ultimate expression or the ultimate way we analyze what our life is all about. And so if ultimately pleasure, happiness is the goal, then you would expect a logically consistent mind to always bring you back to that point. And so here he's telling Pythocles that he's glad to write him back because he expects a pleasant result from the process of writing it, from the results of writing it and sending it out. As we'll see in the next sentence, he knows that there are many people who need the same kind of thing. But the point I wanted to raise to make sure we cover it in the episode today and maybe even next week as well as we go through the real raw science here is that Epicurus has this bad rap that he's not really enthusiastic about the study of nature. He's just doing it because he feels like he has to, because it's important for his having a good time. And I think that's a very superficial understanding of the issue. And it helps to remember that the reason that you constantly see comments like this, and this opening of Pythocles has some of the best comments along with that indicate that peace of mind and sure confidence are what we're after. We must live free from trouble. He's constantly talking about the reason why we're doing what we're doing. And it's not because he's downplaying the importance of nature and science and so forth, but he's just being honest and being rigorous and telling you that you need to have a reason for everything you do. And the reason for pursuing science, pursuing the study of nature, is the pleasure that it receives. Just like in this case, the goal of writing the summary to Pythocles, the goal of all of what Epicurus is doing in presenting his philosophy is to produce a happy life. So maybe we should use that as a segue into 85. Therefore, as I finished all my other writings, I intend to accomplish a request, feeling that these arguments will be of value to many other persons as well, especially those who have but recently tasted the genuine inquiry into nature. So especially those who are sort of new students of Epicurus, and also to those who are involved too deeply in the business of some regular occupation, which would probably include everybody in this podcast and everybody who's listening to it, because we're all just constantly bombarded with the demands of daily life that we don't have the time, in most cases, to just spend as much effort studying these things and nature for ourselves as we would like. And so therefore Epicurus says, therefore lay good hold on it, Keep it in mind and go through it all keenly, together with the rest which I've sent in the small epitome to Herodotus. So just like he said in the letter to Herodotus, you're not always needing to have in your mind constantly every detail of the philosophy, but you do need an organized outline or an organized framework by which you can cross-reference the details so that you know that your framework is consistent with the details when you go for them, but you just don't try to constantly keep every detail in your mind at every moment, because that's just not possible to do. The point of Epicurean philosophy is not to fill your mind like you're a book, but to give you the material that you can then turn around and live your life properly. So you're not going to live your life according to every jot and tittle of the book. You're going to live your life according to the framework, the worldview that you develop, the big picture that you develop through the study of nature.
Yeah, I thought the beginning of 85 is another one of those, at least for me, again, that humanizes the whole idea too. Because I get this vision in my head whenever I read, I finished all my other writings, and I get this vision of Epicurus's desk with piles of papyrus and writing tablets and ink and this sort of thing, sort of cluttering his desk, and he's like shoving away like things. He's like, okay, I'm done with all that stuff. Now I can actually write this letter to Pythocles. It just, the images in my head that I get of that just like I said, really humanize Epicurus for me.
Yeah, I love that as well. It's great to have these little snippets.
Exactly. And I do think it's important too, there, like you were saying, Cassius, that he talks about, those too deeply involved in the business of some regular occupation, and the fact that, that emphasizes for me that he's not talking to a commune of students, living walled off from the world. He's talking to people that go about their daily lives and they're trying to follow Epicurus' philosophy. So he's not talking to some sequestered community there.
Yeah, he's not necessarily expecting everybody to become like him and to become a professional philosopher. He's talking to people who he knows are going to be involved in daily life, but who still need a philosophical framework to live successfully by.
And I love the fact that Herodotus is cited there. So it really links together the letter to Herodotus and the letter to Pythocles, that he's referring to one of his other works in this letter here. And I think that's a great, I think it's great that you all have gone through the letter to Herodotus, because I will admit that it's one of the ones that I sort of poo-pooed for a long time. And I think you all really wrung a lot of good stuff out of it in the episodes from the past few months, I think. So I'm really glad that you did that. And I think that hopefully we can find a few nuggets of wisdom in this one too, in addition to the clouds and the size of the sun and all that sort of thing.
Because what you're saying there, generally people just go straight to the letter to Menorchius and they read that and they sort of stop at that point. They don't go back. Even though these letters, even though Herodotus and Pythocles contain all this very important general material, they don't just contain a bunch of detail. It's a shame that letter is not referenced in one of these other two, because I guess there's always some mystery as to what order he wrote them in, whether Menorchius was, that's the one that people will say is the one written in the most elegant style, if I remember correctly, right, Don? Mm-hmm. So it's always been interesting to me whether to think of that as being before these or after these, but I don't think there's really any inconsistency between them. You see the emphasis on pleasure in all of these, and there are ethical and epistemological issues involved in all three that certainly seem to me to be consistent.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And I think that it's too, I think it really, even though Epicurus is obviously writing these to individuals, he wrote a letter to Herodotus and he's writing a letter to Pythocles, that we really can use them. And I hesitate to make the analogy, but we can really use them the way the letters of Paul are in the Bible, that it's maybe to one community, but it has a larger significance and a larger application over and above those individual letters. And Epicurus even refers to it here in this, that he's talking about, it's not just you, but these people that are involved in these occupations, maybe other people can get some help out of this as well.
That is the implication, Don. The implication here is that Pythocles will have read the epitome to Herodotus. So
right, exactly.
Absolutely right on that. So Martin, now you are retired. I'm wondering how this opening to the letter to Pythocles strikes you.
You're
still as busy as ever.
Yeah, that is a surprising thing. I don't see that I have much more time than before. When I filled the head with a lot of conference calls I do for fun, and I cook by myself, and the day is gone.
I did want to ask Martin, because I know that Cassius has brought it up a couple times about using the word science, and I agree fully with everything Cassius was saying, but I'm always somewhat hesitant or somewhat cautious about using the word science to refer to what was going on in ancient Greece. And I was wondering if Martin had any thoughts on using that word science to say what was going on with the study of nature and that sort of thing in that context.
Yeah, at that time, I think what you wrote as a comment is exactly expresses it. So at that time, occupation with science was just part of philosophy, and it was not a discipline on its own, let alone the different branches of science. So that was all still under philosophy and nothing really separate out. And there were no really separate professions on this one. So if someone was a philosopher like Epicurus, then he somehow could live from this one, but that one was broadly as a philosopher. And that's why some guy like me, who made a living about science and engineering derived from it, that person just didn't exist at that time.
Yeah, it was just part of like they did explore, and I fully agree that they explored nature and they tried to come up with some explanations and stuff, but using the word science always like gives me, I'm like, I'm not quite sure whether that's the right word, but I know exactly what it's sort of like whenever we use the word logic, that we can use it in a broad sort of proverbial sense or colloquial sense, or a strict definitional sense of logic. So it's like science has that same sort of fuzzy definition for me, and I'm not always not quite sure whether it's the right word to use or not. But like I said, I agree with everything Cass just said. I'm just like, just tweak it a little bit.
I think you're also bringing in the question of what's really meant by the term scientific method as well. Is
right.
that what?
And right.
And whether what they're doing. Go ahead, Joshua. I figured you'd have something on that. Go ahead.
I had a history professor who loved to. He said it was from Francis Bacon, but I haven't been able to find the quote. But it goes something like this: that for all of their knowledge, for all of their wisdom, for all of their learning, the Greeks have not given us one good experiment. I don't think that's exactly true, because Eratosthenes did do a pretty good experiment in Alexandria to determine the shape of that the Earth was round, and to determine the size of it.
Yep, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah,
exactly. But that's the only real one that I can think of. The Greeks invented hydraulics. They didn't really do much with it. They invented steam power. They didn't really do much with it. There's no steam engine locomotive racing across the Peloponnese in the 4th century or the 2nd century BC.
Oh man, there's an alternate history fiction book waiting to be written there.
Exactly. And the Antikythera mechanism is remarkable as well. So there's these almost, you might even say, trinkets from the ancient world. But as for the method of science with experimentation, you don't really get that in the ancient world. What you do get really in Epicurean philosophy for the first time is one of the key tenets of modern science, which is methodological naturalism, which is the idea that whenever science is going to look for an explanation, it's always going to assume that there is a natural explanation.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. Yeah, definitely.
So let me correct now this Francis Bacon thing. So this was a status of maybe 50 years ago or 40 years. It was Eurocentric. And then later on, I think most newer science historians agree that it's rather Ibn al-Haytham who basically was pioneering the method of science, so the methodology. And he was at the same time a pioneer of optics, and that was that was in the 10th century, if I recall it right. So that means it's of course Francis Bacon was then one of the later ones, and especially from just a European perspective. In Europe, he was then consequently the first. But Ibn al-Haytham was before him. He was an Arab scholar.
Okay, yes. Can you spell it, or just be clear for people who are listening who might not be familiar with that name, because I know I'm not.
Okay, so it's IBN, then Al, and Haytham, H-A-I-T-H-A-M.
Okay, and he was Arab or Muslim or?
Arab, yeah, of course he was Muslim, and Arab scholar. And he essentially figured out a large part in optics, and essentially introduced the scientific methodology.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
say that Baghdad in the 10th century was sort of the intellectual center of at least the Western world. Mainly, I mean, excluding India and China by that.
And the Arab world was really the sort of the inheritor of a lot of the Greek findings and texts and things like that too. Do I remember that correctly? That's sort of the way that some of that survived, in addition to, of course, Constantinople and that sort of thing.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, Maximus Planudes was a Christian monk, and he rediscovered Claudius Ptolemy's lost work on geography in a bookseller's stall in Constantinople, and it was totally lost in the West. And then he made the first real map of the world in the modern age based on Claudius's writings. And then he starts getting letters from the crowned heads of Europe because they want his map.
That's awesome.
The whole every Greek in particular gets preserved mostly in, as you say, in the Arab world. A lot of the Latin stuff was preserved by the church in the West.
And that was whatever the church decided to preserve. One thing, sort of to pull us back in then, one thing I forgot to mention about the paragraph 84 that I thought was interesting was whenever he talks about arguments which lead to a life of blessedness, the actual word that's used in the Greek is the same word that's used for the life of the gods in Principal Doctrine 1. So Makarios is the same word that's used here as it is there. And I think that really gets missed sometimes in the translations too, because the fact that the same word is used throughout and it's variously translated as blessed or happy or that sort of thing, but it's the same word that Epicurus seems to use consistently for what kind of life you want to lead, and it's literally a life of the gods, because it goes back to that Principal Doctrine 1 with Makarios over and over again.
That's a good point. Okay, we started this section when Don made a comment about whether to apply the word science to some of the material that we're talking about here. And certainly that is a book or an article that definitely needs to be written, because there's clearly a lot of deep thought involved in why didn't the ancients move further in their technology? And was there some attitude problem? And if in fact there was some lack of, quote, scientific method, unquote, what is the scientific method? What was lacking in this thought, from our perspective, that led them in a different direction or did not lead them in the same directions that we are led today? I think that it's a very similar question to what we started out our discussion with today, in terms of when people think that Epicurus sort of shortchanged science. But as we continue to move on in the text here, the next sentence, I think, is one of the crown jewels that people will talk about when they want to ridicule Epicurus, or they say that he's doing something wrong. And it extends not just to the issue of science and whether science for the sake of science is worth pursuing, but I think it's probably even wider to the entire issue of virtue. Those Stoics who understand anything about Stoicism, one of the cliches of Stoicism, virtue is its own reward, that you do these things for themselves. You don't.
I'm sorry,
do them.
I threw up a little bit in my mouth there. I was like,
what did I misstate something?
No. You said exactly right. Yeah, virtue is its own reward. I'm like,
virtue is its own reward. Exactly right. And I think I was watching some mindless movie the other night trying to decompress, and one of the ways I think people see that, the old is it 20th Century Fox or the Roaring Lion, and underneath the Roaring Lion are the words ars gratia artis, which I understand means art for the sake of art.
That's MGM.
MGM. Thank you very much. I think it was some old Bob Hope movie, so I'm not sure MGM continues to use that slogan or use that anymore. Maybe they do. But at any rate, you have this constantly out there. Art for the sake of art, virtue for the sake of virtue. You have this contention by these competing philosophies that there are other intrinsically good things beyond pleasure, and that it's just very narrow and really not very nice of you at all to focus on pleasure being the goal. But here again in this next sentence, Epicurus is just very clear. First of all, then, we must not suppose any other object is to be gained from the knowledge of the phenomena of the sky, whether they are dealt with in connection with other doctrines or independently, than peace of mind and a sure confidence, just as in all other branches of study. So this is one of those sentences where he's just being very clear that all the time that we're talking about studying the phenomena of the sky, we're not trying to be the best astronomers who ever came down the pike. We are keeping in mind the reason that we're exploring astronomy, which is the same reason that we do everything else. We are trying to live properly. And in Epicurean terms, living properly is frequently associated with the ideas of peace of mind and a sure confidence that we're doing the right thing, that we're living the right way, and that we're pursuing the right goals. So again, this is one of those sentences that it's used against Epicurus by those who believe that virtue is its own reward. It's used against him by those who believe that being religious is its own reward, by those who believe that looking for a reward taints everything that you do. The very idea that you should look for a reward for doing the things that you do is held as one of the best signs that what you're doing is depraved in many modern philosophies and many philosophies throughout the history of the world. So there is just no way to cut it other than that Epicurus's position on the goal and the reason that you do things is very different than mainstream Greek philosophy.
Amen, Brother Cassius.
Again, that's everything I'm saying today. Seems like a rant, but let's stay with this one. Anybody have a different interpretation of that particular line at the end of 85?
Well, I want to make a rather obvious point here. He says that we must not suppose that any other object is to be gained from the knowledge of the phenomena of the sky, except for peace of mind and sure confidence. There's a subjective pursuit in these things, and that is the pursuit of pleasure. Even after you've gotten to the point where you've more or less ruled out for yourself any influence from the supernatural, you've secured the much vaunted peace of mind that you were pursuing and the sure confidence about how nature works. At that point, the reason to continue to pursue nature ultimately is going to be for your own pleasure.
And you made a good point, Joshua, too, in previous episodes about talking about that's where Epicurus found his most sure joy in the study of nature.
I have the exact quote here, Don. I've been waiting for a moment.
I'm setting you up. Go ahead, spike that ball.
This comes from the opening of the letter to Herodotus. He says, I who urge upon others the constant occupation in the investigation of nature and find my own peace chiefly in a life so occupied, I have composed for you another epitome on these lines, summing up the first principles of the whole doctrine. He finds his own peace chiefly occupied in the investigation of nature. So another great opening to another very good letter, and I'm happy we had a chance to go through that one.
Right.
I will say another thing that sort of gets missed too in translations too is that peace of mind is the word ataraxia. So that's the, shall we say, infamous word of ataraxia, but that's the word that's actually used there.
Okay, let's explain why you would say, shall we say, infamous. Let's go back into that for just a moment again, because somebody may say, who's listened to what we've just said, well, Epicurus, he didn't say pleasure, he didn't say happiness. You just read something that's contradicting what you just said. Epicurus did not say that the reason to study nature was pleasure. He said the reason to study nature, the object to be gained from it is, quote, peace of mind, unquote, and, quote, a sure confidence, unquote. He didn't use the word pleasure. You guys are misrepresenting what Epicurus is saying. And so, again, Don, you've just brought up this word ataraxia. Well, Epicurus doesn't say that the goal of life is pleasure. He says the goal of life is ataraxia. How do we reconcile and explain the answer to that question?
Ataraxia is just another form of pleasure.
And I would say peace of mind is another form of pleasure.
Exactly.
And although we would probably want to parse the words a sure confidence, that's also a pleasure. Obviously, you have to be careful with that. But the feeling that you have grasped something, the feeling that you do have an understanding of it is a pleasurable feeling. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And of course, nobody's ever said that pleasure can't lead to pain if you misuse it. In other words, you can have a sure confidence about something, and maybe you're wrong about a particular fact. But at the moment that you have that sure confidence, that is a pleasure, I would say. Just like you can eat ice cream and it's a pleasure, but by the time you hit the fourth gallon of ice cream, it's no longer a pleasure to you anymore.
Well, like maybe not to you.
Depends on how much you can take at one sitting. Yes, indeed. But it is the contextual issue where there's really no test for what is a pleasure other than the feeling of pleasure. It may sound like a circular discussion, but pleasure is a feeling which you feel. And when you go back into Torquatus, when you go back into several places in Epicurean philosophy, ultimately that is Epicurus's proof that pleasure is what nature gives us to choose, because that is the only direct contact, that's the only automatic mechanism of telling us to go forward that nature has given us, is that we find that activity pleasing. So, in other words, the tangent there was just to hammer down the point. We've had a question just come up recently, and we've got a new thread starting about it, that people will say, well, Epicurus talks about natural and necessary desires, and that we should probably give preference to those that are natural and necessary as opposed to those that are unnatural and unnecessary. And so it becomes interesting about exactly what is the analysis that he is giving there. Is he suggesting that there is a list of activities that nature has inscribed in the sky somewhere, that you always should follow a certain activity in every situation? And so people will say, well, does that mean that there's a natural good? Are there certain natural goods that are out there that you should always pursue? And we're not going to be able to go down that rabbit hole here today in this discussion very far, but ultimately, Epicurus brings everything back to that feeling of pleasure. You can parse things out and categorize them and use your logical reasoning to talk about things that are pleasures, and you can decide which of them for you are more potent, which of them are more longer lasting, which of them for you are going to be obtained with the least cost and pain. But every time you go past that word pleasure and you try to quantify some golden list of activities, you're going to run into problems that result from the need to be clear in your mind about the difference between pleasure and good and other words like that, which are very subtle in their implications.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting too with along with ataraxia for peace of mind, the sure confidence one in the original Greek is pistin babaion, and pistin is related to epistemology and how we know things, and pistin is what gives you confidence or assurance, and that babaion is that steadfast, sturdy confidence in how we know things. So I think that's the fact that word is related to epistemology and how we know things is kind of an interesting little sidetrack too.
The flip side of the pleasure coin is pain. And part of the project of pursuing pleasure is to excise pain from your life. And that is what we're doing. And part of what we're doing, at least when we investigate into the causes and phenomena of nature, is we're excising pain and mental anguish and anxiety. And Epicurus says elsewhere, and I may regret bringing this into it, that the limit of the quantity of pleasure is the removal of all pain. So by pursuing confidence, by pursuing peace of mind, by pursuing and trying to get rid of actually pain, all of these are sort of pathways to the ultimate pursuit, which is the pursuit of pleasure.
Amen, Brother Joshua. How about that? I'll throw that one in too.
Very good. Very good. One more comment on the sure confidence issue. I would suggest that there's a relationship between that term, sure confidence, and what we discussed last week at the end of the letter to Herodotus about those people who can study phenomena, and yet if they don't understand what they've studied, they may actually be worse off than before they started the study. And where I'm going to go with that is sure confidence means what? To me, if you say that you have a sure confidence in something, you have a sure confidence in some conclusion that you have reached about something. You don't necessarily just have a feeling of confidence detached from reality. You just don't feel confident in general. You can, I suppose, but generally I think the important thing would be that you're confident about something. And the reason I bring that up is that there's this interesting issue that we've seen recently in the A Few Days in Athens discussion with Frances Wright about where she talks about near the end of the book that you should study the phenomenon of nature and that observation is everything and that theory is to be avoided because observation is everything. And I think that that's something that we need to develop over time because I think she's going down a path that's got some problems to it. because we're talking about, for example, here, observing the sky. The Babylonians or the different people who are into astronomy or even some form of astrology who just simply map out the movements of the stars and the planets, they may become very technically proficient in being able to follow where things are in the sky and even predict where things are in the sky. They may come up with a very sophisticated, that Antikythera mechanism that Joshua has mentioned previously, extremely sophisticated methods of chronicling an observation about where things will be at a particular time. But unless you translate that observation into some conclusions about the nature of the universe and the nature of your life and whether there's a supernatural God who's going to send you to hell for the rest of eternity, unless you translate your observations into theories that you can have confidence in, and theory may not be the best word, worldview or just an understanding of something. Again, just because you can predict where Mars is going to be in the sky on a particular night doesn't necessarily give you any understanding about why Mars is going to be in that area of the sky in a particular night. You have to carry forward your observations I think this relates back to the scientific method that Don was talking about earlier. You come to conclusions and hypotheses that you test according to reality, but the whole purpose is not just to stop at observation. The whole purpose, I would echo Epicurus here, the whole purpose is not to just simply have a journal and record the facts of what happens every day of your life. The point is to be able to come to conclusions about the results of the different things that you do and how best to spend your time, how to lead, therefore, the happiest life. So there's just a lot of moving parts here in every one of these observations at the beginning of this letter. Mm-hmm. And I would say this is the kind of high-level outline of the philosophy that Epicurus would be thinking about. You know, you've got, 37 books on nature. Well, you're not going to be able to keep those 37 books in your mind every moment. And even if you could, those 37 books aren't going to tell you how much ice cream to eat today. They'll give you the method of analyzing the question, but they're not going to give you the answer. It's up to you and your mind to apply the observations through philosophy, through a worldview, through a system of thought. As Lucretius talks about several times, a system of study of nature that leads you to be able to use the material and not just be able to refer to it.
And that's why I think we're so lucky to have the letters, because, I mean, we don't have the 37 books of On Nature only in fragmentary form and citations or references in other works. And so the fact that Epicurus saw value in writing these epitomes and summaries, and we still have them, I mean, that's some of our surest links to the philosophy.
Okay, I think this is going to end up being one of our better podcasts and summarizing some of the most really important points of the philosophy here. But in the interest of time, let me try to get it in a normal length episode. By now referring to 86, which I think is also a fascinating observation. We must not try to force an impossible explanation, nor employ a method of inquiry like our reasoning about the modes of life or with respect to the solution of other physical problems. Witness such propositions as the universe consists of bodies and void, or that the elements are indivisible. All such statements in circumstances where there's only one explanation which harmonizes with the phenomena. For this is not so with the things above us. They admit of more than one cause of coming into being, and more than one account of their nature, which harmonizes with our sensations. So let's talk about the distinction that he's drawing. It's very interesting that he is saying that when he says we must not try to force an impossible explanation nor employ a method of inquiry like our reasoning, either about the modes of life or with respect to the solution of other physical problems. So it seems like he's almost saying that in respect to modes of life, we really have a firm single explanation that we're confident of, as opposed to the motions of the stars, which we cannot come down to a single explanation. Okay, that's enough explanation. What do you guys think?
You may not like this, but I got another tangent I have to jump in.
All right, go ahead.
You mentioned the Babylonian astronomers, who you're absolutely right to say they were very good, but they absolutely could not predict where Mars was going to be at a certain point in time. And to tie it all up into a neat little bow, I mentioned Claudius Ptolemy and his lost work on geography. He wrote another book, and it was called Almagest, which has an Arabic title because it was preserved in the Arab world. And it's called The Greatest, is the literal translation. It's all about the phenomena in the heavens, much like we're dealing with in the letter to Pythocles. Now, it'll be worth noting that the word planet comes from a Greek word planetos, which means wanderer. And in the very end of Claudius Ptolemy's book on the phenomenon of the heavens, he said, "When I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, my feet no longer touch the earth, but I stand in the presence of Zeus himself, take my fill of ambrosia." So here's the problem. They've figured out the movement of the stars. They figured out the movement of the sun and the moon to a decent approximation. But they get to this issue of the planets. They can't come up with an explanation for why they do the things they do. They go in a certain direction and then they turn around and go back in the other direction for a bit. And the problem is it didn't accord with Ptolemy and his geocentric model of the universe. This was a impossible explanation, to quote 86, which he tried to force. And when it couldn't explain the phenomenon that he was seeing, he immediately threw up his hands and said, it's got something to do with Zeus and the gods. And the fact that I don't understand it and can't give an explanation for it puts me in closer contact to the intelligent designer who built it all.
So you're illustrating that some degree of knowledge and some degree of study can even cause you worse problems than if you'd not started that direction in the first place.
Yeah, and if you stick to one explanation when it comes to the heavens and you don't do what you're supposed to do, what Epicurus says to do, which is you've got to come up with a few different explanations. And it may not be possible, given our remote position from the heavenly bodies, to actually know which explanation is the best.
All right, Don, you take that. I think a key part of it here, and thank you for correcting me on Mars, because you're right, the wanderers, I should have realized I should have used a star as something more predictable than the movement of the planets. But the focus of the passage seems to be that in circumstances where there's only one explanation which harmonizes with phenomena. He's saying that there are certain situations in which there's only one explanation that harmonizes, but in other cases, there's more than one explanation that harmonizes the phenomena. So what's the difference in perspective between those two categories of things?
That's a good question. I'm sitting here trying to think, because he's very adamant about the atoms in the void, that's the only explanation that makes sense. And yet with the planetary bodies and that sort of thing, he is more open to alternative explanations. So that is an interesting what sets his confidence, to use the word confidence, what sets his confidence in that he has discovered that atoms and void are the one explanation for that.
We need to spend some time parsing that out, because I think it would be wrong to imply that he thought he had figured out everything about. He was confident that everything is made of atoms and void, but that doesn't mean that he could assemble them himself into any thing that he wanted. He knew his conclusion was limited to a part of what he's looking at. He's not able to then take that information and use it to manipulate everything and create things in any way or form that he'd like. But he was confident that ultimately in that direction lay the answer for everything else. But in the stars, or in the movement of the planets, maybe we should just focus on that. I would say that the difference is that he just doesn't have when you're talking about things right in front of you, you can be more confident that nothing comes from nothing or nothing goes to nothing, because you're just like right on top of it. Right. But with the things that are in the sky, you really are so far away from it and have such problems in even observing with accuracy what's going on that you have to be much more cautious. I think that's the direction.
And it's interesting that you can observe the stars and the planets and the clouds and everything like that. You can observe them, but you can't observe atoms and void. And yet he's able to build on the basic fundamental building blocks of his reasoning and his observations to go to the things that you can't observe and almost be more sure about those than you can about what makes the sun rise and fall and the rise in the east and set in the west, that sort of thing.
Yes. And on that point, exactly, Don, there's a difference between, I think he's equally confident that the sun and the stars and the planets are not gods, as he is. He's equally confident in that as he is in the theory of atomism.
Everything has a material basis.
Yes.
That's the sure confidence that he has, that you're not under the aegis of some capricious god.
And that applies to the operation of atoms, and it applies to the operation of the planets. But he's able to go much further in discussing atoms because he, I think, has those right in front of him. When, in fact, when you're looking at things in the sky, there are numbers of possible physical, natural explanations that could cause something that we see that we just don't have enough information to know which of those is correct. You can suggest reasonable explanations that are consistent with everything else that you do know here on Earth, but you can't determine which of those is the right one.
Right.
Cassius, I think you're touching on the right answer there, is that when we're looking at the sky, we can't get any closer. We can't, go up and touch the moon or the sun to see what it's made of. Anaxagoras thought that the sun was a hot rock. Some people think that the sun is a god. We can't actually go up and, knock on the door and see what's going on up there. What we can do with the phenomenon of the sky is we can offer a number of different natural explanations. And by doing that, we have now rendered grossly improbable or even impossible any supernatural explanation. What we can do with atoms, by contrast, is we can offer a number of lines of evidence for why we think this is true. And every single line of evidence seems to confirm that it's true. So, for example, what Epicurus can do with atoms is he can walk around Athens and he could show you a statue where the bronze or the brass or the marble is being worn away or polished. He can take you down the street to a bakery and demonstrate that the smell is wafting to you. The smell of bread is wafting to you between the walls. And it's that kind of thing, I think. These multiple lines of evidence.
Multiple lines of evidence, like, for example, the things that are right in front of us. We can not only see them, but we can touch them, we can smell them, we can taste them, we can feel them. But with the stars, all we've got is sight. We don't have those other four senses that we normally have to apply to everything else. And we don't have the ability to, like you say, walk up close to it like we can with things around us.
I do have to offer one minor correction. Lucretius does mention that in addition to sight, we have the intensity of the heat of the sun.
Good. That would be a good point. That would be right.
Yeah. The sun. And that's a teaser for future topics in this letter.
That's absolutely correct.
On the size of the sun. Yes, indeed, which we're also discussing contemporaneously.
Well put, Josh. I think you have it exactly right with the thing about the statue wearing away and the wafting smells. And again, that really, I get this impression of, Epicurus walking around with a couple people around Athens and them asking him questions. And he's like, well, take the statue over here, for example, that sort of thing. It's like, it's such a personal way of expounding the philosophy too, that it just just get these images in my head of just these conversations taking part in these busy agoras and all that kind of stuff, and it's just, like I said, it really humanizes it for me.
Yeah, he can take you into a cave and you can see water accumulating on the bottom of the cave, and gradually the water will deposit sediment, which will turn into stalactites and stalagmites. It's that kind of stuff. There's physical evidence.
Yep.
For the existence of very, very small, minute particles just all around us if you're looking in the right place.
Yeah, well put. That's excellent.
Okay, and we're focusing on evidence and we're focusing on the sensations. And so let's use that to contrast as we move to 87. As opposed to evidence, what are the things that people will suggest to us might be a substitute for evidence? 87 says, "For we must not conduct scientific investigation by means of empty assumptions and arbitrary principles, but we must follow the lead of phenomena." And then this is the part calculated to make any Stoic go into a rage. "For our life is not any place for irrational belief and groundless imaginings, but we must live free from trouble." So again, the goal, pleasure, living free from trouble. But evidence is the basis for the Epicurean worldview and the way we come up with our conclusions. We're not going to be relying on, quote, empty assumptions and arbitrary principles. How would you guys talk about examples of empty assumptions and arbitrary principles or arbitrary laws, according as the way Hicks translates it?
My surface reading of this is that by empty assumptions, he's talking about stuff like, the theology of the Greek pantheon and that kind of thing. I mentioned Claudius Ptolemy talking about how when he doesn't understand nature, he's closer to the gods. And by arbitrary principles, this may be a coded reference to mathematics and geometry, which he didn't seem to hold in very high esteem.
And when you say closer to the gods, you went back to that example a minute ago. The other one that jumps in my mind at this moment, Joshua, I believe it because it's absurd. It's the very absurdity of the contention that makes it believable. I forget who's associated with that argument. It's some famous theologian.
I think it was G.K. Chesterton.
I believe it because it's absurd. Oh my gosh.
Let's see if I can get a citation on that.
Yeah, but I think that's exactly what is being referenced in your earlier example from the Babylonian who was communing with Zeus by calculating those things. And of course, the other example that you're currently referencing, the geocentric model of the universe. That would be an example if you're going to try to force something to fit into the geocentric model of the universe that just doesn't fit into it. You're not going to be going down either the road of successful science or peace of mind. You're going to have a problem.
So I was completely wrong. It was actually Tertullian.
I was thinking it was very ancient. Do you have the quote?
Tertullian is widely regarded as having originated the expression credo quia absurdum est. Est is in parentheses there. So credo quia absurdum. I believe it because it is absurd.
I don't think there's possibly any formulation that we could come up with that would be so starkly different than what Epicurus is all about. Empty assumptions are empty. Arbitrary principles are arbitrary because they have no evidence behind them.
So regarding is incredible because it's absurd. That means in the ancient world, they had conspiracy theorists as well, because, I think this is what these guys jump on usually.
Yeah, you've used a loaded term there. There's all sorts of people who make all sorts of assumptions and attribute all sorts of things without any evidence, it seems like, whatsoever. And birds of a feather flock together, and it seems like the more someone is into these kind of theories that have no evidence behind them, it seems like they sort of attract more theories that have no evidence behind them. But the way to avoid ever going down that road is to always be willing to test everything that you're suggesting according to whether there is evidence, and evidence has to be grounded. This is where you go back into the ultimate authority of the sensations and the senses. Evidence comes from the senses. Just because you can imagine something is not evidence that it exists. And in fact, that is what he says here. Our life has not now any place for irrational belief and groundless imaginings. Those are not evidence. Did I lose everybody? Am I still connected?
We're stunned by your brilliance, Cassius. Sorry.
I thought so.
Just letting that nate in my brain for a minute.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still back on the absurd. It's like,
yeah, well, let's talk about that. I believe that's what we're talking about here. Please bring me back into reality if I'm wrong, or let's come up with additional examples. But our life has not now any place for irrational belief and groundless imaginings. That's what he's considering empty assumptions and arbitrary principles to be. Ultimately, I don't think there's any way to parse that down. Ultimately, there's no way to divide that up, other than to acknowledge that what makes something empty, what makes something arbitrary, is that it has no verifiable, reproducible evidence to support it. That's what makes things irrational and groundless. If there's a better way to approach that, please, let's articulate that as best we can. I think that's one of the key issues of Epicurean philosophy.
No, I think you're on the right track there, and I don't have a whole lot more to say about it.
It sounds like nobody wants to come to the defense of the argument that I believe it because it's absurd. So if you think that Tertullians
it's a good argument if you put good in quotes. That's
yeah, that's right. That's exactly right, Don. That's a really good comment, I think. What is the meaning of good? God is good. Well, does that mean that everything associated with God is good? It's just so circular and so arbitrary, and so I don't usually like the word empty very much, but empty is so empty of evidence. What is it empty of? What is it arbitrary of? It's empty of confirmable, repetitively observable evidence.
I know in the past you've expressed misgivings about the word empty, empty desires and that sort of thing. And in fact, I was just looking at the cost of flogging the dead Greek horse here, that irrational beliefs in the Greek is kenes doxes. So same word, kenes, that he uses for the void and empty desires and all that kind of stuff. He uses that here for that word. And of course, the doxis is the kuriai doxai, the belief. So it's just empty beliefs, irrational beliefs that don't have any foundation to stand on, that sort of thing.
The Dead Greek Horse is a great title for your
All right. I think we can get to the very end of what we set out for our text for today. We just go a little bit further because he is kind of just repeating his point over and over. But if there's ever a point that deserves to be repeated over and over, it's this point. Now, all goes on without disturbance as far as regards each of those things which may be explained in several ways so as to harmonize with what we perceive when we admit, as we are bound to do, probable theories about them. But when one accepts one theory and rejects another, which harmonizes as well with the phenomena, it's obvious that he altogether leaves the path of scientific inquiry and has recourse to myth. I can't imagine anything more awful than to leave the path of scientific inquiry and to have recourse to myth. Now we can obtain indications of what happens above from the phenomena of the earth, for we can observe how they come to pass, though we cannot observe the phenomena in the sky because they may be produced in several ways. Yet we must never desert the appearance of each of these phenomena. And further, as regards to what is associated with it, we must distinguish those things which can be produced in several ways, which is not contradicted by phenomena on earth. Hicks does it better. Hicks says, however, we must observe each fact as presented, and further separate from it all the facts presented along with it, the occurrence of which from various causes is not contradicted by facts within our experience. That introduces that word contradiction, which is also, I think, a key part of what we're discussing, is that you can have facts that are consistent with your theory. You can have facts that contradict your theory. You've got to deal with both of them and not just ignore and not just cherry pick those that you like and ignore those that you dislike. Just like all sensations are true, you just can't cherry pick those that you like and discard the ones that you don't like. If you're having sensations that contradict other observations you're making, you need to find an explanation for why you're having them. You just don't ignore them.
One of the claims creationists make about Darwinian evolution is that it is not reproducible and therefore not falsifiable and therefore not scientific. But there was, I can't remember who it was, but one famous evolutionary biologist was asked what it would take to disprove or at least cause a major problem for our current understanding of evolution. And his reply was fossil rabbits in the Precambrian, because it didn't exist at that point. And so this would be a contradictory fact, which we would have to find some way. We'd have to give an account for it, because the theory stands or falls on this progression, and things that are found out of order are a huge challenge to that.
And so far, we haven't found anything, as to the best of my understanding.
This might be because of the circular path in this prehistoric research. The thing is that biologists use geologic formations to date things, and the other way around, the geologists use the fossils as their calendar. So it means there is something in there that these two sciences basically confirm each other's biases.
Well, that is maybe true to a certain extent, but to another extent, we have other areas where we can check this. For example, there's an unusual layer of iridium at the KT boundary, which was an artifact of the asteroid, which struck about 65 million years ago. And this is basically true no matter where we dig down on Earth. Iridium is a very heavy element, and so it tends to sink toward the center over millennia, but the asteroid contained iridium. And when it struck, it, I guess, catalyzed very quickly, and it went up into the atmosphere. And as it settled, it formed this layer. And you can find this layer. And that gives you one check against the problem you're describing, Martin, which you obviously will know far more about than me. But there's dendrochronology is another source. Obviously, carbon dating, if it's usable on the material, is another source. You're right to say that there's a problem, I think. But as I said, I think you know a lot more than I do about it.
I see that current discussion as a perfect example of why he's writing the letter to Pythocles in the first place. The idea of most people ever having a confident understanding of those details of the scientific history of the formation of the earth and evolution and so forth, most ordinary people are going to throw up their hands and say, there's no way I can ever understand that. There's no way I can ever deal with that. I don't even know that I can remember that this is an issue to think about if I'm reading your 37 books on nature. But Epicurus is hitting, I think, as hard as you can, that the basic issue is that you have to look at all the evidence and make sure that you don't come up with theories that are not consistent with the evidence that's available to you. We'll continue to talk about that point probably through the rest of the podcast here today. But I also want to remind, I think I might have said Principle Doctrine 25 earlier. It's really Principle Doctrine 24, which starts out talking about if you reject any single sensation and fail to distinguish between your conclusions as opposed to those which should await confirmation. In 24, you've got a very lengthy and wordy and kind of labyrinthine statement of the position, but it really comes down to ultimately very simple observation that you can't let your study of nature, your view of the world, just conform to empty assumptions and arbitrary laws. But you have to follow the promptings of the facts. And when he talks about facts, he's talking about the sensations that are available to us that we can observe for ourselves. And we have to harmonize our observations with our theories about what's going on with the world. And if you don't do that, if you desert that method, then you're going to altogether leave the path of scientific inquiry and you'll have recourse to myth. You'll be basically wandering in the worlds of fantasy and mythology and myth. That would be a good word to get the Greek for if at some point, but it's clearly a fantasy that he's talking about as opposed to reality.
It is actually the word myth that's used in the Greek. It's a mython, so it's definitely Latin. I thought it was interesting too, with my misgivings about the word science. Whenever they use scientific inquiry in that section there, that the original is his what is the actual word is in that particular point is the physiogolematon, physiologematos, which is the physiologos, or the study of nature. So he's hearkening back to where he uses that term that sort of literally translates as study of nature. But he definitely uses the word myth there.
The study of the nature of existing things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
One of the things that catches my eye at this point in the conversation on this 88, in Bailey's wording, he says, yet we must never desert the appearance of each of these phenomena. What that triggers in my mind is I'm not sure that there's anything more basic in explaining why a lot of us think that Epicurus had something good to say from those who don't. I think Epicurus is your archetypical example of someone who refuses to desert the appearances, who refuses to desert his sensations and his observations of the study of nature that are available to him and reproducible by him and that make sense to him. He's never willing to desert those in favor of imaginings about things that could happen, but that don't have any evidence to support them. Maybe in my mind, all of Epicurean philosophy ends up being sort of an evidence rule of what are you willing to consider to be real in life and what are you going to reject? What standard are you going to apply to decide whether what someone is saying to you is empty, fantasizing, or whether it's something serious that has to be considered? And if you constantly always go back to the sensations and to the obvious conclusions that you can draw from the sensations, I think that's the ultimate thing that keeps you within the rails of a reasonable approach to life. From the very beginning of Book 1 of Lucretius, his starting point, nothing comes from nothing. And everything else follows in a chain reasoning from his observation that nothing comes from nothing. And to me, that's what I think about a lot of times. I would be willing to just totally, completely abandon Epicurean philosophy and go over to whatever religion was presented to me as the right one if you could show me evidence of something coming from nothing, of some force that's producing on a regular basis miracles. I mean, the early Christians, that's presumably why they were so focused on miracles and so forth. Because raise somebody from the dead in front of me, go out to the cemetery and dig up some body and bring him back to life by waving a magic wand over him, and I'm going to be pretty impressed by that, actually. As scientifically minded as I might wish to be, I'm going to be pretty impressed if you can systematically go out to the cemetery and dig up graves and raise random people from the dead.
But you will look for a material cause, though.
I will look for a material cause. Because you have
trust and confidence that it is a material universe.
Right. I mean, it would be entirely possible, I would say, that maybe some superior civilization from some other cosmos flies their spaceship over here. And maybe they do have the ability to take a dead body and somehow regenerate it from its DNA or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt that you have to be very careful about the way you apply that line of thinking. So you're going to be looking
you could describe that as, godlike abilities too. I mean, that's
Right.
that's where,
Right.
yeah.
You're right. That's what you think of gods as being able to raise people from the dead, maybe. So that would be when Epicurus uses the term godlike. He can do that consistently with the rest of his philosophy because he's always stipulating that it's not supernatural. And so your superior beings from some superior civilization in another constellation, well, they probably have the ability to do things that we never could do ourselves. But that doesn't make them supernatural creators of the entire universe.
And I will be nitpicky. I think I've nitpicked on this before. And if I remember correctly, it's the phrase that Epicurus uses is not nothing comes from nothing, but nothing comes from that which does not exist. So there are always pre-existing atoms that are going to rearrange themselves and everything. So that's sort of the point that he makes, that the atoms are going to be there no matter what, but they're going to rearrange themselves into different things. But you can't, there's nothing that doesn't exist that isn't going to constitute things in the future.
Right. And that's in the letter to Herodotus. And Lucretius says nothing comes from that which does not exist at the will of the gods. He adds that phrase on. Joshua?
The Latin phrase, or a portion of it, though, is nihil ex nihilo.
Oh, that's right.
From nothing.
That's right. Yeah, there's a section in Epicurus somewhere, I think, that talks about, that nothing comes from that which does not exist. So that's the one thing. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right in Lucretius. He does use that.
In my narrow little mind, I just see the world in two different directions. There's people out there who suggest that I believe it because it's absurd is good reasoning. And there's people out there who suggest I believe it because I have evidence for it is good reasoning. And I find myself in only one of those two camps. I can't find myself in the other camp at all.
Part of the problem, Cassius, to go back once more to Claudius Ptolemy and his book on astronomy, is that this became the template for astronomical thinking for the Catholic Church, predominated all the way up to the Renaissance. And it was partially because of this, and largely because of the Catholic Church, of course, that you get these early astronomers who, Galileo Galilei, for example, who come under fire for challenging the prevailing view because the people who hold that view aren't willing to, I'm looking for the exact quote here, they're not willing, or they are too willing, I guess, to desert the appearance of each of these phenomena. They're too tied to the theory. They won't reconsider it, even in the face of what is starting to become at that time, really starting to become modern astronomy and modern science.
That's a really good point, Josh. Well, that really drives home the whole idea that Epicurus gets at about picking one theory and sticking with it no matter what.
Yeah.
Which is something we see constantly in our discussions. I'm forgetting the cliche or the quip about somebody saying to somebody else, what do you do when your opinion is confronted with new facts? I change my opinion. There's some quip. I'd have to find that. Or maybe a whole series of quips on that particular point. But I think all of us are confident that that's what Epicurus would do as well, even in regards to some of his contentions on atomism. And I'm not aware of any fundamentalist Epicurean who would suggest that Epicurus would not incorporate modern discoveries about subatomic particles into his theory. Right. His theory is not that there's an electron spinning around a neutron and proton. He wasn't going in that direction. He was making logical, ultimate conclusions about whether there are ultimately indivisible particles or not. So we incorporate all new facts, any evidence that comes to our attention that is reproducible and verifiable. It would be totally contradictory to Epicurean philosophy to say that, well, I'm going to ignore those. Epicurus says time and time and time again, you never ignore observations that you can prove through your senses. And so, therefore, if your theory is going to be caused a problem by some new fact, you then do exactly what he says. You wait. You distinguish those theories which are confirmed from those which are not confirmed. And you don't just select a single theory and stick with it regardless of the changes in evidence. On the other hand, in many of these issues that we're talking about, there are several possible theories that are consistent with the evidence that we have and that are not contradicted by the evidence we have. And in those situations, when you've got multiple theories that are consistent with the evidence, you don't pick one and decide to put it on your flag and say that I'm going to be on theory X come hell or high water. You say theory X could be true, theory Y could be true. They're both supported by the evidence. I'm just going to keep that in my mind that either or both of them could possibly be true if they don't contradict each other. There could be more than one cause why the water that's in front of you is boiling. So that's the approach that I gather he is suggesting.
Cassius, there's a quote by a well-known comedian, and I'm not going to use the names to avoid anything political here, but he says he believes on Thursday the exact same thing he believed on Tuesday. And then there's a beat, and he says, regardless of what happened on Wednesday. Some things should cause us to rethink our position on a lot of these issues. It's good to be doing that constantly, and I think that's why Epicurus says that the study of nature is the chief source of peace in his life. You have to constantly refine what you think you know is true.
Right. I'm thinking of a quip that I believe was attributed to Winston Churchill, but this is such a big and common point that I'm sure there's multiple examples of how to express it in witty ways. Much wittier than I'm able to. Okay, we've gone longer than we normally would, but probably one of our most important episodes so far because of the meat that's here in this opening to the letter to Pythocles. So let's talk about closing statements. And for that, we always go first to Martin.
Oh, I have nothing else to add.
Okay. Don, your closing statement?
Closing statements. I haven't done those in a while, have I? No,
right.
I think just to sort of reiterate what I said too, I think that the opening of the letter here really humanizes Epicurus, really gives us a glimpse into the workings of the garden, gives an idea of the friendly relations among Epicurus and his students, and the fact that he was willing to provide help to people who needed it. I just think it's a really interesting way to start out. And like you said, there's a lot of good general advice and basic foundational concepts in the beginning of the letter here.
Okay, very good.
Well done. That's just great. I think my closing statement would be, thank you, Don, for joining us today. You surprised us this morning, and it couldn't have gone better, I don't think. And,
no, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you in particular for filling in for me next week.
You got it.
And if you people talk about the size of the sun without me, I'll never forget.
No, we'll make sure that you are present for that discussion. And you know what you just said, Joshua, about Don's presence. That's one of the things that I observe that's probably worth saying here for people who are studying Epicurus and who really trying to get the most out of it. It's my observation that people, like those of us here on this podcast who just enjoy talking about it to other people who, Don's done some great work on the Greek words that are involved in the letter to Menorchius and so forth. The best way to get the most out of Epicurean philosophy is to work to apply it, to work to talk to other people about it, and to just keep interested in it. And those who just go straight to the letter to Menorchius and read a few things and move on are just not going to get the most benefit out of it, and the kind of benefit out of it that could if they really apply themselves to it. There's a tremendous amount here. Epicurus just stands so starkly differently than most other philosophers. And Martin was making the comment earlier about the Arab philosopher and so forth. Most of us who are listening to this, we come from the Western tradition, the Western backgrounds, and there are no doubt other brilliant minds throughout history and other traditions besides the Western ones. But for those of us who are Western in orientation, I don't know anybody remotely close to Epicurus who stands at sort of the head of this tradition that has not been the majority, has not been the prevailing worldview for the last 2,000 years, but probably is one of the most representative of the alternative that was once rejected, but maybe not forever.
We're here to turn it around.
We're here to turn it around. Just like the King Arthur once and future king, I think Epicurus is the once and future philosopher of humanity in a very deep way that transcends day-to-day politics and transcends day-to-day issues that, my gosh, here we're recording this on June the 12th of 2022, and we have all sorts of problems that are potentially going to get a lot worse and that distract us, that call us away from the study of philosophy. Epicurus is a great way to keep grounded on the ultimate questions that will concern us on our dying day.
And on that note,
but not only on our dying day, but on the days that are even more important to us than that, which is our today, our current life, our current choices that are in front of us about how to spend our time today. Okay, and on that note, that's a good place to stop before we run too long today. So thank you, Don, for joining us today. Thank you, Martin and Joshua, as always, and we will come back next week with the next section of the letter to Pythocles. So thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks and bye.
Pleasure.
bye-bye.
Bye.